this quality of urgent necessity can be seen in my conviction that once I do this, then I'll be able to meditate. I've just got to do this first. Then I'll be able to meditate. So it could be something completely trivial, or it could be something huge, or anything in between. So for example, if only I get this latest piece of tech, then I'll be happy. Or if only I get this job, then I'll be happy. Or if only I get this relationship, then I'll be happy. This is craving. This is drivenness. And what the Buddha says in the second truth is that it's the drivenness itself that conditions our chronic dissatisfaction, not what we imagine we are missing out on. Or we could simply say drivenness itself is painful. So that's the second truth. The third truth is the cessation of dukkha. What causes dukkha to come to an end? And of course, dukkha ends when drivenness ends. And the fourth truth takes us to the question of practice, what we should do to bring our dukkha to an end. And this is represented by the Eightfold Path. So you've got these four truths. Dukkha, its arising, its cessation, and the path. You notice the first truth is one thing, dukkha. Then it opens up, second and third truths are two things. There's craving here and dukkha there. And the second and third truths are about dependent arising. It's about a relationship. Where you have craving, you have dukkha. If you don't have craving, you don't have dukkha. Specific conditionality, dependent arising. So the four truths themselves are a version of dependent arising. It's at the very heart of everything that the Buddha teaches. So if we come to the practice that we're doing satipatthana, or the applications of mindfulness. Mindfulness is a standard translation of the Pali word sati, which literally means memory. And we've talked about this, that mindfulness remembers the present. And it can be compared to the sign that you might see in a railway station saying, mind the gap. And what that sign is saying is, remember there is a gap between the train and the platform, and remember it in the very act of stepping in or out of the train. So remember the present. Keep the present in mind. This is mindfulness. So mindfulness is not awareness. It's the felt continuity of awareness. By felt, I mean directly experienced. It's not up here. It's not a concept. It's an experience. So when we are not mindful, we forget our awareness. And we gave the example of driving down familiar streets and suddenly realizing I have no memory of the past 3 blocks. I forgot my awareness. When we are mindful, we remember our awareness. For example, it's like being absorbed in a game, playing a game where we cannot afford to lose a single point. So we're just staying with the action all the way through. So we're tracking experience over time. We're paying close attention to whatever is happening as it happens. And we're watching how experience unfolds over time. Why do we do this? Because we want to understand what is happening. If we track our experience over time, we begin to see the patterns in our lived experience as they unfold over time. In other words, we begin to see dependent arising and specific conditionality. So let's look at a couple of very ordinary, very mundane examples. I notice as I'm meditating, and even in daily life, I notice that when I am upset, my breathing changes. It becomes agitated. When I calm down, my breathing changes. It calms down. In other words, I can see that my emotional state conditions my breathing, and my breathing conditions my emotional state. These are both dependent relationships. So I notice these patterns and I develop an understanding that body and mind can condition each other. And if I see this often enough, this understanding becomes second nature. And so, whenever I feel emotionally agitated, naturally I check my breathing and I calm it down. Or, alternatively, whenever I feel my breathing becoming agitated, I naturally check the state of my mind and calm it down. So I find myself learning to balance through the conditions of life. And I'm doing this through noticing a particular pattern of dependent arising, a specific conditionality. And this pattern becomes part of my everyday reality. Let's look at another example. I am meditating and I suddenly think of a situation that has angered me. So I've got a story running through my mind, and it's perfectly obvious that this story is entirely 100% mental in nature, and it's about the past, so it's not actually happening. Yet my body reacts. So my shoulders tense, or I feel heat in the face. In other words, body sensation is conditioned by thinking. And then I notice that when the body is disturbed, this gives the story in the mind fresh juice, fresh energy, and feeds it. So this story must be real because look at what's happening to my body. So thinking, um, so body sensation conditions thinking. Thinking conditions body sensation conditions thinking. These are dependent conditional relationships. This is dependent arising. This is specific conditionality. So I start to notice these things. And again, this noticing becomes second nature to me. It's just almost automatic. Not quite, but almost. And if I recognize this pattern, then it arises, and then I've got something to do. I can do something about it. So this brings us to Chaitana that we were talking about this morning. For example, I want to break this pattern. So I choose to focus on one part of it, not get caught up in the whole thing. So for example, I might focus on the body sensation as just body sensation. A sensation is just a sensation, and not pay any attention to the story. And then the whole thing starts to fade away. Uh, body sensation, working with body sensation has the advantage of always being in the present, while the imagined situation is in time, past, future, or present. And to the degree that I can anchor myself in the present, then the pull of the imagined past or the imagined future fades away. So work change the body, I change the mind. So what we're talking about here is when we practice mindfulness meditation, what is revealed is a network of physical and mental events, all of them conditioning each other, and together they create a lived reality, what I think is real, what I think is really going on. So how do we apply this to our meditation practice? The Buddha lays out different kinds of conditional relationship. The later Abhidhamma, the Patana, I've forgotten actually 20-something conditional relationships. Anybody study Abhidhamma? How many conditional relationships are there in the Patana? I've forgotten. Surely there's some scholars here who can tell us. But anyway, it's 20-something, I'm sure. 24. There were so the Theravada Buddhists, when they analysed all this, 24. Very good, excellent. When the Abhidhammikas, the people who developed and studied the Abhidhamma, when they pondered this issue, they decided there were 24 different kinds of conditional relationship. They all have their own characteristics. One of them, which is very early, it's the Buddha himself explicitly talks about this. So it's very early and it's very important. This is called ahara pachaya. Pachaya means conditional relationship, and ahara means nutriment or food. So nutriment relationship or food relationship. And it's food, the Buddha calls it food or nutriment because the way it works is it is what feeds our sense of self, what feeds our sense of who we are and what the world is. So it's a very important conditional relationship. And in one discourse in Mahatanha Sankhaya Sutta in Majjhima Nikaya, Majjhima 38, if you want to have a look at it, there's one part of it which I find very interesting because you can see the Buddha as meditation teacher having interview with his students and how he conducted that. And the actual dialogue is very formalized because this is typical of the suttas. But underneath this formal dialogue, you can get a sense of an actual encounter between the teacher and his students. So the Buddha is examining his meditation students and he says, do you see this has come to be? Yes, Bhante. Do you see this is generated with that feeding it? Yes, Bhante. Do you see when what is feeding it ceases, what has been generated necessarily ceases? Yes, Bhante. So if you look at this brief dialogue, what the Buddha is doing is he is training his students to recognize a particular pattern in their experience. So number one, identify the present event. What is happening now? And you notice how we keep coming back to that. Like, what is it now? And the Buddha begins by asking his students if they are clear about the nature of their experience. Now, he doesn't ask what is, but he asks what has come to be or what has been generated, depending on how you translate it. In other words, the very language that he is using suggests that experience is dynamic. It's not something static, already here, fixed, but it's coming and going according to conditions. So even the language that he uses is putting this across. So first, identify this experienced event now. That's the first step. Second step, what feeds this? Now, this question opens up the circle of interest and attention. Let's call what we are experiencing now as B, the second letter in the alphabet. The Buddha is asking if it is true that B arises because of conditions beyond itself. Or more simply, he's asking, what's feeding B? Does B arise because A feeds it? And does B cease when A is no longer feeding it? This is the question that he's asking. And you notice how things start to open up at this point. So we looked at the example of breathing. I notice breathing is disturbed. What feeds this? Question mark. So I open up my circle of attention and I notice my body is tense. What feeds this? I open up my circle of attention and I notice that I'm thinking something painful. So I start to open up the awareness and I start to see the dynamic relationships between things. This is one of the reasons why we use the secondary object, because we're using that to open things up a bit. If you're doing a purely serenity meditation, you just focus on the grounding object. You don't worry about anything else. In other words, you're limiting the possibility of seeing conditional relationships because you're just absorbing into one thing. But when you're practicing for insight, you're opening up because you want to see what the dynamics of the situation. So first step, identify the present event. Second step, what feeds this? Third step, what does this feed? So what happens next when this arises? Can I see one thing is leading to another? Can I see these conditional processes in real time? Because if I can, that means I can intervene and make alternative decisions and take that process which is heading in this direction and change the direction. And this is all about karma and changing the direction of our lives. But I can't do that unless I first see the pattern. So let's apply this to the experience of distraction. And of course, the first thing we have to do is to establish whether anybody here has ever experienced distraction. Have you ever thought to yourself, if only this would stop, then I could do the practice? Have you ever had that thought? I see at least one yogi is vigorously shaking her head. Never. Very good. Top marks. In other words, have you ever felt that something is getting in the way of your practice or something is preventing you from practicing? This is distraction. So distraction is the felt obstacle in our practice. What gets in the way? That's distraction. So we are practicing mindfulness meditation to understand the patterns of experience. If the patterns of experience regularly include distraction, and if distraction is important because it prevents us from practicing meditation, then it naturally follows that distraction is part of the pattern we are meant to uncover. And we should be studying it, not condemning it. Do you see why that's the case? If distraction is important, because it stops us from meditating, then this is an important part of the pattern that we are meant to be studying. We need to understand it. What we tend to do is to condemn it instead of understanding it. So I'm meditating, I realize I'm distracted, and often my response to this is to criticize myself. Oh, I can't do this, I'm no good. Or to condemn whatever I think is getting in the way. If only those people would stop making noise, then I could meditate. And then eventually I decide I better get back to the meditation object, and I start the whole process all over again. And this is a waste of a good distraction. You should never let a good distraction go to waste. What if we decided to treat distraction, quote unquote, as an important part of our practice rather than its enemy? So we're studying the flow of our experience as it unfolds. And as we do this, one thing that becomes perfectly obvious very quickly is that attention moves from one object to another. So for example, I'm following my meditation object, and the next thing I know, I'm in the middle of a story. Attention moves from the meditation object into story. So I return to my meditation object. Attention moves from the story to the meditation object. But pretty soon, I'm back in a story. Attention moves. So this becomes really obvious pretty soon. So what's happening here? What's going on? So this is what we need to investigate. So we've summarized the practice as subtle awareness in the body and then see what happens. So if we are studying the patterns of experience, then we are interested in the fact that attention moves and how it moves. Because this gives us the opportunity to see impermanence and dependent arising in action in real time. So we do not take distraction for granted, and we do not fight our distraction. Rather, what we're doing is we are learning to see distraction as our teacher. We become familiar with the patterns of our distraction, and we learn to ask certain questions about it. So for example, when does it happen? How does it happen? Now, this sense of investigation involves a reflecting back upon the immediacy of the experience in order to develop a wider picture. So I've got the actual experience, boom, 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 but I've also got a looking back on that to get a sense of a wider picture. So let's explore this issue by looking at one particular distraction, thinking, which we've already looked at before. So part of this is just a revision of what we were doing before, but it's putting it in context. So question number one, let's say I'm distracted by thinking. Question number one, what has arisen? What is happening now? So what is this distraction? What is it really? Now, we might assume that this is obvious. Well, I'm thinking. Okay, fine. But what is thinking? Really, what is it? And how do I know that I'm thinking? What is it that tells me, oh, this is thinking? So we learn not to take anything for granted, but to become interested in what is happening. So we explored that in the workshop by asking the question, how do I think? Do I think in words? Do I think in visual images? Do I think in feelings? Do I think in combinations of these? Do I think in something else? So this is the first question. What is it exactly? And then I might even ask, what do I think about? For example, are my thoughts predominantly about the past, or are they predominantly about the future? Is there some subject that I'm obsessed with that I keep coming back to? Or, well, let's move on to the next one. What characterizes these thoughts? Are they very active and energetic? Or are they drifty and dreamy? So, for example, do I find myself obsessed by a particular subject? I keep coming back to this one story or one particular kind of story. Or could it be about anything at all, so long as I'm thinking? This is what characterizes the thinking. Now, all of these are examples of learning to perceive thinking as events that arise within the mind. What kind of events are they? So, number one, what has arisen? Number two, what feeds this distraction? So I realize that I'm distracted. I recognize what it consists of. And then I might look back to what happened just then. What triggered the distraction? So two things that I might look at. What was I aware of when my attention slipped away into thought? And another question might be, what was the quality of my awareness when my attention slipped away into thinking? So for example, let's say you're doing breathing meditation. Are you more likely to be distracted on the in-breath or the out-breath? Now, this is a really basic question. So if someone comes in to interview and I say, so what's your grounding object? I'm using breathing. And they say, but I'm distracted. I keep falling into thinking. And often the first question I will ask is, so when do you slip off into thinking, on the in-breath or the out-breath? And often the response is, what? So, no idea. To which I respond, well, find out and come back and tell me. Pay attention. Just to give you an example, there's when I was at Mahasi Center practicing with Sayadaw U Pandita, it's a long time ago, and at that time he was very fashionable, and he had lots of foreign students come to practice with him in Burma, including some people who were teachers in their own right. And there was one particular person who came from overseas, very well known in the Dharma world. Now, this is a story I heard, so strictly speaking, it's gossip, but it's a good story, so I'll tell you. So this person came and started meditating and really liked it, really got on with the Sayadaw and so on. And one day he's meditating and he has this profound realization and he's just blown away by it. And he was full of gratitude to the Sayadaw for guiding him so skillfully. Now, of course, the style that the Sayadaw taught in the sitting, grounding object is rising and falling of the abdomen. And as it happened, this person had his profound realization when he was doing sitting meditation. So he comes to interview and he makes his bows to the Sayadaw and he says, Sayadaw, I just want to express my gratitude, such wonderful teaching, such superb guidance. I've had this incredible experience and it's completely changed my life and it's all because of you and blah, 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 blah. And eventually he stops talking. And the Sayadaw says, this profound realization, did it occur on the rising movement of the abdomen or on the falling movement of the abdomen? And the yogi was completely taken aback and he said, I don't know. And the Sayadaw said, please be more mindful. Let's toss him out. It's very typical. I like the story because it's very typical of U Pandita's approach. Very grounded. But pay attention to the changes. Like what feeds this? What was there when it changed? And it is actually quite common when in breathing meditation, when people slide off into thinking, it's very common that it happens on the exhalation. Just to give you a hint, although I shouldn't do that. I should wipe that from the recording so no one else hears it. So the movement of attention away from my meditation object into distraction. What feeds this distraction? So in the Satipatthana Sutta, the Buddha talks about when you look at chitta, heart mind, check and see what is coloring the heart mind. Is it attraction, the movement of the mind toward an object to hold onto it? Is it aversion, the movement of the mind away from the object of experience to resist it or defend from it? Or was it delusion? Just don't know. So was the movement of attention away from my meditation object triggered by, for example, attraction? I just really want to think about this. Was it triggered by aversion? I don't like meditating. I'm fed up with this. I just need some entertainment. Think. Was it triggered by delusion? I was just swept away by habit. Or I just forgot I was meditating. And the next thing I know, I wake up in the middle of a story. So these are three obvious things to look for. Just to give you one example, often, one time I was doing walking meditation and the mind would just slip off into thinking quite quickly or with great determination, like bang. It wasn't just kind of drifting off in a dream, it was boom. And I thought, this is interesting. I wonder what's triggering this. And so I looked and I realized it was aversion. I just didn't like what I was doing. You know, I was walking up and down this meditation track and it was nighttime and I was tired and enough already. So there was aversion. So in order to get me away from that, I would just catapult into a story. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I continued the practice. And every time the awareness slipped away, I would ask the question, avoiding what? Question mark. And the awareness would go bang, exactly on what the mind wanted to escape from in that moment. And then continue. Attention slips off into thinking again, avoiding what? Bang, there it was, something else. And it turned into a really interesting walking meditation because I could see the patterns of aversion in my mind in real time. And it was quite interesting. So what feeds this distraction? And then what does this distraction feed? So what's the result? Does it feed a sense of frustration? I can't do this, I'm getting really frustrated. Well, if it does, then what exactly is frustration? Where in the body do I feel it? What characterizes it in the mind or the heart? Do I enjoy the distraction? Am I having fun here? What does enjoyment feel like? Where in the body do I feel this pleasure? What is it that's giving me pleasure? What is it about it that's giving me pleasure? I'm just interested. I'm just curious about what's going on. And so I bring this curiosity to the process. So when we were working with thinking as meditation object, we were saying that it's our habit to regard what we think as being more important than the activity of thinking. So when we're caught up in our thinking, we think our thoughts are of great importance, even when it's objectively, it's very clear that they are a complete waste of time. This habit of getting lost in the content of our thinking is very strong because we've been cultivating it since childhood. But here we're cultivating a new habit, that of directing our awareness to any part of the activity of thinking which is not the content. So for example, when I ask, what is this thought? Or how do I know I am thinking? I'm aiming awareness at the appearance of thought rather than its content. When I ask, what's feeding this thought? I'm aiming my awareness at what conditions my thought, not its content. When I ask, what does this thought feed? I'm aiming my awareness at the results of thinking, not its content. So this is one area in which we can explore distraction. And a distraction is one area where we can explore dependent arising. Obviously, the subject is much bigger, but we're just focusing on a few basic points. It helps to take a playful attitude to your practice when you're doing this kind of thing. Do not take it too seriously, but treat it as a game. I like to say that the Dharma is far too important to be taken seriously. What happens when you take something seriously? First of all, it becomes very heavy, and then you put it up onto an altar to worship it. What you don't do is play with it. But it's important to learn to play with the meditation method. What you're doing when you're experimenting does not have to work. It doesn't have to be successful, but it would be nice if playing with it was fun. And the more we play with our meditation practice, the more likely we are to learn. Be careful of the dark side of investigation. Every technique has its dark side. Every technique has its disadvantage. There's no such thing as the universally valid technique. Now, in what we've been talking about, particularly the investigation of thinking, but basically the investigation of anything, is we end up thinking about it. So a meditator might end up thinking about thinking, and that's a complete disaster. So every practice technique has a dark side. Every practice technique has a disadvantage built into it. Every practice technique can become an obstacle to your practice. So be careful about the dark side. But try these things out, particularly what is it? What's feeding this? What does this feed? It gives you a basic framework around which you can start to explore. So try it out. You might see something or you might not. If you do not see anything, forget it and move on. Try again later. Do not cling to results. Your experiments do not have to give you a result that you like, but play with it and see. Okay, that's enough for tonight. Thank you very much.
Brother and sister, Patrick had just concluded his talk. We shall end the live streaming now. Good night and see you tomorrow.